Cowabunga dudes, this is TheHande and welcome back to Ranking the Soundtrack, and this time it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 Turtles in Time. Again, we're going by the unofficial Aqualung rules of ranking the soundtrack, which means no intro theme, no cutscene themes, no boss themes, and no ending theme. This is just a ranking of the 10 main level themes, and yes, this includes both of the songs that play in the Technodrome, the main level theme, and also the elevator theme going up. So let's get on with the ranking. At number 10, Starbase. Starbase really is my least favorite song on the soundtrack. It does in fact have a distinct melody that flows through the song, but it's kind of chaotic and all over the place. It just has too much noise and the instruments just give it a very chaotic feeling. In a way, I suppose it's appropriate since the level is just full of enemies and pretty much every notable enemy makes an appearance during this time. But the song is very unpleasant sounding. It never gives me a nice feeling, and because of that, it actually makes me enjoy this level a lot less, which is why it appropriately falls to the bottom of the ranking. At number 9, Big Apple, 3 AM. Now, appropriately, I do think this is sort of the song that I immediately think of when I think of this game. It does have a very good level 1 feel to it. Not too oppressive, there's a nice break in between the drums and such, but it sounds a little incomplete. It almost feels like parts of this song kind of appear in all the other tracks later down the line. It feels a little too airy, as I kind of pointed out. It doesn't really sound like a full song. Number 9 and 8 on this ranking were pretty interchangeable, and the differences are slight. I do enjoy this track. It does put me in a good mood when I listen to it, but it maybe lacks a distinctive edge. At number 8, Alley Cat Blues. This is the level 2 theme, and I think it kind of suffers a little bit from the same problem as Big Apple. It just sounds a little too generic, but it does actually have a much fuller sound, and it gets me a lot more amped up, and I think that's the difference which makes me like this song a little bit more than Big Apple. It's not any more complex from a composition point of view, although it does have a more distinct, more jazzy tempo to it, which is kind of funny. But you shouldn't take the title Alley Cat Blues too literally. I mean, it's not really blues in any description. For me, this is kind of where the game honestly properly gets going. It has a much more of a traditional beat-em-up sound to it, if that makes any kind of sense, and that's why it just barely beats out Big Apple. But like I said, depending on the day, I kind of like these songs pretty equally. Number 7, Prehistoric Turtlesaurus. The intro of this song, especially the synths and the drums, kind of reminds me of an intro of this really obscure Finnish sitcom that none of you have ever heard of. The point is, this song has a very strong 80s sound to it, which I think is sort of weirdly appropriate considering this is the first level in which you go back in time. I really love the breaks in between the drums, and generally speaking, this has one of the most distinct sounds of any of the tracks on the soundtrack, which is why it already beats out the first 3 tracks, which I think all sound a little bit samey, but there's no real apex point to this. It's very chill and kind of slow, which is why I had to put it on the lower half of the ranking. At number 6, Technodrome, Let's Kick Shell. Now, from a structural point of view, the beginning of this song is honestly quite similar to songs 8, 9, and 10, but what sets it apart is that there's a pretty distinct change in the overall melody halfway through. Electric guitar sounds are a little rough around the edges, but they clearly tried their best with the Super Nintendo sound chip, and I don't think it sounds bad by any measure. I really love how the drum breaks down, and we get this really nice, smooth transition towards the end, which is really my favorite part of the song, and the way it loops right back into the opening section. It has both a kind of a positive energy, but also sounds kind of serious and dire. Now, I do like the elevator theme a lot better, but this is definitely the most energetic and most varied of the tunes we heard thus far, so I think it deserves to top the bottom half of the ranking. Number 5, Bury My Shell at Wounded Knee. Now, let's be clear, the opening bars of this song have been directly ripped off from the Ennio Morricone composition for a few dollars more. And honestly, it sounds badass, especially with the faster tempo. I kind of miss the bridge part. It kind of makes it feel like the song's kind of half complete because the latter half kind of goes off on its own direction with the synth sounds and what have you. Now, I don't think the second half sounds bad by any measure, but it's kind of obviously the weaker part of this entire composition. That iconic opening melody is so distinct, and even when I was younger and long before I even saw the Sergio Leone Dollars trilogy movies, that was always my favorite part of the song. So unfortunately, because the best part of the song is a direct rip-off, I don't think this song deserves to go much higher, but it is one of the standout tracks on the soundtrack, which is why I had to give it a spot in the top 5 at the very least. Number 4, Going Up, or the Elevator Theme. So this is the second half of the Technodrome level, and easily one of my favorite songs from the entire soundtrack. That guitar sound that was very rough in the first half of the Technodrome level sounds very appropriate for this one, and it also sounds very aggressive. After all, this level is literally nothing but a slugfest. I mean, it is the obligatory elevator level that you find in most beat-em-up games. And for such a confined space, I find it funny how pumped up this song actually is. Now, it's also very straightforward. It doesn't actually have that much complexity to it, but I think it does the most with the least amount of elements, which is why I've always very much liked it. It always makes me a little bit sad that you don't hear it in any other level, because I think they could have used it maybe as like an enemy rush theme or something like that. But yeah, at any rate, one of the standout songs on the soundtrack, which is why it goes up to number 4. At number 3, Sewer Surfing. Now, this is a very straightforward and kind of an upbeat song. I mean, sewer surfing is kind of a bonus level-y type of place, but I have always enjoyed it a lot. It sounds very distinct, and even though it's not a particularly complex piece of music, it does again have 2 distinct parts. And I think this one sounds the best going from the first part to the second part. There isn't like a big disconnect, and I don't think either one of the parts sounds weaker than the other one. Again, it's very similar to Going Up in the sense that it does a lot with relatively little sound-wise. But I think Sewer Surfing actually manages to run itself up into a more complete song. I mean, don't get me wrong, this would get a bit tiresome if you had to listen to it for too long, but it always manages to put a smile on my face, so that's why it goes all the way up to number 3. At number 2, Skull and Crossbones. Now, Skull and Crossbones is not my favorite level in the game, despite the fact that it is a pirate level, because it's honestly full of all kinds of bullshit. But this is hands down the most complex, and I would say the most complete song on the soundtrack. It has 3 distinct parts. There's the slow build-up part, then the fuller second part, and then kind of the refrain part, which kind of plays around with the melody a little bit. And that build-up and those phases is what always makes this stand out, especially the low build-up. It might actually be my favorite part of the song, because none of the other songs on the soundtrack have that part. And better yet, they actually do the build-up again at the end of the song cycle, which is great, because that really emphasizes what a good part it is. I also love the main section of it. I do think the drum sounds in this one are possibly some of the best in the entire soundtrack. Now, the main melody isn't my favorite. It's kind of noodly and all over the place, but it does fit the soundtrack so well. This is such a well-produced song that it would have been a crime not to have it at least as number 2 on the soundtrack, and I did very briefly consider having it as number 1, but obviously there could only be one number 1 song on the soundtrack. And at number 1, Neon Night Riders. Yes, this is going to be a bit of a personal pick on my part, because this is by no means the most energetic piece of music on the song. It does have a pretty powerful beat behind it, which is weird because the melody parts are so goddamn smooth. It's very soothing, but also manages to keep you awake with those aggressive drums. Now, of course, Neon Night Riders is also a kind of a bonus level-y sort of place, and I think the song is appropriate for it. And it's weird how the sort of aggressive drum beats and the smooth melody just work so well for me. There are these nice build-ups, and it loops around very well back into the beginning of it. It just sounds so incredibly cool to me. I have always enjoyed this song immensely, and because of that, it has always been my favorite song on the soundtrack. Like I said, Skull and Crossbones is definitely way more complex, and I would argue Sewer Surfing is actually maybe even a slightly better crafted song. But this one just manages to put me in a good mood, and I always enjoy playing Neon Night Riders every single time that I play this particular game, so that's why it goes to number 1. So that was the ranking. Let me know what are your favorite songs of this soundtrack. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.